Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to some Starcraft. So, we're playing as random, we've ended up as Protoss. This is a recording of a previous game, of course, as you can tell from the fact that I can see both of us over here. We're up against a Terran player who was playing specifically as Terran, who is apparently Diamond. I'm playing qualifying matches, so if this guy's actually in Diamond, something has gone horrifically wrong. But yeah, I just wanted to get a little bit of a talk out about this game, just because Soul of the Void is going to be coming out, and I might be doing some Soul of the Void content, because I really liked Starcraft before Heart of the Swarm came out, and I played quite a bit of it, and I got quite high up there. In fact, I was a Diamond 1 ranked player, and I was actually pretty okay at the game. Now, I don't think that Diamond 1 is actually like pro tier level. There was such a huge gap between me and the Challenger level players that was kind of almost embarrassing, but that was how it was, and that was where I was, and yeah, it was pretty fun. But I stopped sort of playing near the end of one of the patches that was kind of making things a little bit more frustrating, especially for Protoss players. I used to be a Protoss main, now I play random. And I think that Heart of the Swarm really exacerbated that effect, so I didn't particularly feel like playing once that expansion came out. I played a little bit, sort of explore, figure things out, but I just wanted to do this video to talk about the things that I think they need to do and need to address when Soul of the Void comes out and for Soul of the Void. So one of the major things that I think that their balance team does is when they were making StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty, they sort of didn't know necessarily what it was going to be and how it was going to work. It was pretty well balanced, both for the pro scene, but more so it was not too frustrating for a casual audience to play it. Like, obviously you hear about people who say, StarCraft is like the epitome of difficult, like Dota 2 players can't even, but like, the difficulty of it wasn't so ridiculous. I mean, you had to have your force field splits as the Protoss. You needed to be able to figure out your macro really well with the Terran players. I still haven't figured out how to properly macro as a Terran player. And each of the factions had those sort of little things that they had to worry about. They've made it so that some of the units were too frustrating in the base game to deal with for how easy they were to use and the effects and impact that they could have on the game. A Banshee is a notorious example. It does not take much effort to tech to Banshee and then ram it straight into the enemy mineral line and kill like a million of their guys. And if your opponent is sort of a newer player and you've got a Banshee in there and you hit the cloak button, you can probably wipe out like half of his mineral line. It's kind of too much reward for very little skill, and the amount of skill required to counter it is a little bit too high, but there are very few examples of things like that. I mean, there are certain strategies that are a little bit cheesy that were hard to counter for a newer player as well, but all in all, I don't think that it was too bad if you happen to be the major glut of the player base. And I think that that's sort of an important thing to consider when you're looking at a game like this. The vast majority of the people playing this game are not really professional players, and the professional players require an audience base of people who are not professional players. So if you were to take a game like StarCraft 2 and you were to fill it entirely with just nothing but pro gamers, it's not going to do all that well, because no one's going to watch them. No one's going to be interested in the game. Like, people were interested in the pro gamers and stuff in Wings of Liberty and to a lesser extent in StarCraft. Well, not to a lesser extent, but in StarCraft 1, because they could play the game. They weren't necessarily going to be pros at it, but they could sort of follow along. They could play it, and a lot of people did. Even if they didn't play like ranked ladder, they just played multiplayer games, or they played like games with their friends. And that was because it was pretty accessible to those sorts of players, and it was pretty fun. Like, I played with my bronze level friends in teams games, and I'm actually really bad at teams games. I don't understand the meta for that at all. So what happened when Heart of the Swarm came out, they came out with units that were either difficult and micro-intensive to use, so they were harder to use for their intended role than I think their equivalents from other factions, or they made things that were very difficult to counter unless you knew what you were doing. So a perfect example of this is the Terran Widow Mine as a unit that's difficult to counter unless you know about it. If you're a sort of a player that hasn't figured out the game very well, I mean, it's the thing that where your units walk across the map and they get deleted halfway through and you're not entirely sure what happened, because like you got an alert but you never saw what actually happened to them. It's just suddenly half your units are gone. You need detection for it. It's an anti-air and anti-ground. It's not that expensive, and it one-shots a large number of units in a very wide radius. So the fact that it has these weaknesses that it has got, it's very fragile. It doesn't move particularly quickly. It's extremely immobile, and it has to burrow before it can even attack. Meaning, if you catch them off guard, it's completely useless. Means that it has weaknesses that a higher level player can't exploit. It can also exploit it by just throwing shit units at it in front of your main army, but that's sort of a tremendous problem to me. I take with that unit. I extremely dislike that kind of unit because it does really make it harder for players that are either new at the game or like me, who aren't necessarily back in the game yet. Here we've got the opposite end of the spectrum. This is an Oracle. It's the harassment unit for the Protoss, and unfortunately, it doesn't just have a normal attack like it should. It has this activate pulsar beam ability, which gives it an air-to-ground attack. Now, it is a very powerful air-to-ground attack, and you can see that was killing his SCVs here so quickly that he had to pull them all off the mineral line completely, and this is actually going to have a profound effect on his performance in this game. By contrast, if it was a Banshee, it would be the same thing, though, except, the Banshee is actually much, much more powerful because it can go stealth, and obviously the Oracle can't. The other thing about the Oracle is it is a new detection-type unit, but again, it's not a passive detector. So if I wanted to detect what's going on with the Oracle rather than with, say, an Observer, I have to activate this Envision ability, or I have to activate Revelation. So either of those, either of those is kind of a little bit of an awkward way of doing things, in my opinion. I think that they could have just made it have an air-to-ground attack, and they could have made it a detector. Like, is there anything particularly wrong with simply having it work like that? Apparently there was, I guess. I don't really know. But they've got plenty of examples of units that sort of are working in that direction, and I don't particularly think that's a healthy direction for the game to have gone in. It really did hurt the way that the game functions. So what they're doing for Soul of the Void, for those of you who've been paying attention to the rumors and what's in the beta, the Protoss have gotten another very finicky unit that's hard to use. It's a ball that rolls up to the enemy, then explodes and deals huge damage to ground-only targets. So basically it's a reusable Baneling because it explodes but doesn't destroy itself. Again, this is a very difficult-sounding unit to use by contrast to, for example, anything else, really, and its role is basically just a Psystorm, except it has to run into melee range to use it. It is fortunately invincible while it's doing that, but again, just to reiterate, I don't particularly think that's going to be the easiest one to use. You're going to probably see big plays coming out of it from the pro scene. I think that has a lot of pro gamer potential because it's this big ball. If it runs into the middle of a group of Marines, it's going to wipe out the entire group of Marines pretty easily, and it's got a lot of potential to outplay it as well. They give you the example of just loading all the Marines up instantly into an air unit, an air transport unit, and once that happens, you're going to see that unit just flutter away, not even care. I think that is going to be one of those units that, again, very much catered to the pro players, is going to be extremely powerful at the high tiers, but basically it's unchanged if you're a low-level Protoss player, if your Protoss player has been out of the game for like a year. So if I were to use it, I would botch it. There's no way I can actually use that unit, because you activate the ability, you run it into the middle of the enemy formation, hope they don't stim to get away or split the Marines, and then it just runs in the middle, causes a huge shockwave of damage, hopefully killing all of them, because if it doesn't have an attack. So again, that kind of thing. I think that using it as a tank potentially, because it's invincible while it's charging, might be something you'll see people doing. We'll have to see how that particular interaction works. But yeah, I mean, they've got that as a unit, but they've gotten another unit that is essentially a Marine, basically. It's a Marine that can't shoot air, I guess. I'm not sure if that's the best analogy. It's a unit that basically has a ranged attack. It's a bit like a Stalker in that sort of sense. It can teleport a little bit. It can produce clones and that teleport to the clone. So it's got a little bit of redundancy to the Stalker, but it can't attack air. but it's got a huge bonus versus light units. So a mixture of stalkers and those glaive throwers, I think, might be a particularly effective strategy. And they're a relatively micro light unit. I mean, using the illusion / teleportation effect, especially if you want to get onto the high ground somewhere, is going to be very, very important for these guys. Using the illusions to tank is going to be very important for these guys. But they're, on the whole, going to be an effective-looking unit just because they're huge bonus versus light units with their relatively decent ranged attack. They're going to be pretty impactful even without that much micromanagement. By contrast, the Terran player has gotten a 15 range ground unit that can attack land or air, which I think is absolutely ludicrous. Its damage is relatively low, thankfully, but its rate of fire is very high, so I just don't like the unit concept. It's going to be one of those very frustrating to deal with ones. It can move while firing very effectively. It's got siege tank range, essentially. I believe siege tanks... No, it's got more range than a fucking siege tank. What the hell are you thinking, Blizzard? So, yeah, it's going to be able to move backwards against a unit. It has the same move speed as a stalker. Unlike a stalker, it does not stop to fire. It's got more range than a siege tank, and it's got a very high rate of fire, so its damage per second is actually quite good. So it attacks land and air. It's got more range, I think, than it does. I don't think it actually has more range than a Tempest. I think the Tempest has got equal range, so I guess there's that. But yeah, on the whole, that's going to be one of those very frustrating units to deal with. I don't think that's a very good addition to the game as they're proposing it currently. Fortunately, it's very fragile, so if the Terran player isn't paying necessarily that much attention to it, it could potentially get wiped out, but it is going to just sit way, way back and be very effective at that role. The other unit that the Terran were getting is a 15 range. Like, you can see a sort of pattern here. They're trying to give Terran players ridiculous range for no particularly good reason, in my opinion. But it's a 15 range siege ship that you can build from your starport. And it can attack ground and it can AoE air. So basically, it's like a siege tank setup. Unfortunately for them, they don't actually have the sort of ranged advantage against air units, so Vikings could work against them. Not that Terran versus Terran is something you should be balancing the game specifically around, whatever. Yeah, here's my derpy attack. I kind of didn't realize that he had this much siege tank here, so my guys just melted. But on the plus side, my air assault worked out just fine. I did want to sort of distract him and have him send stuff down there. And as you can see, his Marines just have no real hope against this kind of composition. He has got a ridiculous amount of air defense because this level is like that. Here you can see the Widow Mines. I'm dealing with them by just not giving any craps that he's killing interceptors with them. He kills a lot of interceptors with these things, but they're really cheap and they don't really take anything, so... Yeah, and here his Vikings don't get micromanaged properly, so they just go get destroyed immediately. And yeah, here's the weakness of them. Like, if they don't set up, there's that. He does instantly blow up a ton of my interceptors, but again, it doesn't really matter. So yeah, getting back onto the Terran's new units, they do have that sort of semblance of being sort of frustrating to play against, in my opinion. They have too much range, and having extreme range units like the siege tank can make a unit frustrating to play against, especially if it's very easy to use them. You set them up in a good vantage point, they deal their gigantic siege damage to units from a million miles away, and they're very hard to counter because of that, because if you don't have the range yourself, or even if you do, it's hard to deal with, because they're simply just going to have it use the terrain advantage, and if you can't get your vision up there, then what the hell are you supposed to do? You can't really do anything. So there is that. I don't think that that is a good change or a positive change to the game that they're doing with either of the Terran units. I don't like either of them. They're just too much range for units that have no particular weaknesses. Like, one of them has 15 range and is extremely mobile at the same time. That combination just shouldn't exist. And the Zerg are getting 2 units again that are kind of like that. They're getting the Lurker back from the looks of it. I don't think that that is necessarily something they're actually going to do. That's one of those more unsubstantiated ones as far as I can tell, but the rumor has it that they might be getting the Lurker back. That's got the same problem that I have with the Widow Mine. It's a little bit less extreme because you can counter it with air. You can fly an observer over it, and the Lurker won't instantly destroy the observer if it's got vision. These little assholes, if your observer goes there and they've got vision, then it instantly blows it up. So, I mean, there's nothing you can really particularly do about that, although what Terran player actually builds Ravens? I mean, if he thinks that there might be something over there, he can just always throw down a scanner sweep, and suddenly these things blow up your observers and you can't do anything about it. So, yeah, these things, I just don't like these. The lovely thing about this guy's kill rate is those are almost all, I'm pretty sure they actually are all interceptors, so I don't really think those count. So yeah, the Zerg unit, again, the Lurker, if that does end up being a thing, I think is going to be a little bit of a problem unit, just in the sense that I don't think that's going to be necessarily that easy to counter. It's a little bit less bullshit difficult for newer players as compared to the Widow Mines, just because the punishment time for this is so low, and the presence of them, like the Lurker, I suspect is going to still be powerful, but it's not going to one-shot entire formations if you get out of line a little bit. Like, I shouldn't have to have observer vision for every stupid inch of the map that I'm going through. That's just not very sensible. But, you know, whatever it is they happen to decide to do, I guess. And what was the other unit? I can't remember the name of the other unit that Zerg are getting. It is an artillery-style unit that is basically extremely, supremely high damage. It's as far as I can tell, like very, very, very high damage unit. But it's basically just using how did it work? It was a spell that it had to cast, and it would drop an artillery ball down on a certain area, basically one-shotting anything standing under it. Like, I think their example picture of it, they were one-shotting a siege tank, so that's 160 damage. Now, for demonstration purposes, they might have just buffed the damage, and it's not actually going to be anywhere near that. But what they were demonstrating was that it would one-shot a siege tank, which is apparently... Well, actually, no, it would be 161 damage at least, so it's probably 165. I think that it had a bonus versus armored units, so that would be a part of the explanation as to how that was working. Here again, you've got the stupid siege fortress as well as siege tanks, so not going to happen. But that is fine. So it's going to be a difficult unit to use properly, I suspect. It does have that sort of problem. It's basically the problematic and annoying units of the Terran without being as actually overtly annoying to deal with. And the problem I'm having with a lot of the Terran units is not that they're overpowered necessarily. I don't think Widow Mines are necessarily that overpowered or overpowered at all. My problem with them is that they've got sort of a very difficult interaction with... here I accidentally lose my Oracle because I wasn't microing them very carefully. Instantly gets blown up by a Widow Mine because Widow Mines are, again, very, very powerful. They basically one-shot the first thing that comes within their range every minute or so. I think that again, you know, it's a very frustrating unit to have to deal with, especially because, like, look at all these little assholes. Alright. So, you know, the Lurker, I think, is going to be less of a problem compared to the Widow Mine as they currently are. It'll slow down assaults as well. Here's another thing that I don't like about some of the units that have come in here. Widow Mines are amazing at stalling out or slowing an attack, and I think that what they intended, like, they deliberately said that they wanted it to be like that. They wanted a unit that is capable of controlling a zone, and that means slowing down people who are trying to advance through that area or punish them severely for doing so. The Widow Mine is extremely powerful for that purpose. You basically can't go somewhere without worrying about them, and that really can slow down your attack, because now you have to worry about observer presence, you have to worry that you're using your observers correctly, and you have to make sure that if your observer does get blown up, you have to get new ones, so you have to stall, wait for your entire army before you go back in again. And like, that is not really, I think, something that this game needed, was something that extended the game in that particular manner. Of course, it's not the worst thing. I mean, it is manageable, you can get through them eventually, but it does make the game, even when the Terran player is, like, definitely losing, it gives you something that slows you down to the point where it's very frustrating to have to deal with. Here my carriers are sort of like just... the reason I'm using carriers is also because of these stupid, like, things like Widow Mines and Mech Terran. I mean, Mech Terran can't really deal with these carriers all that effectively. They've got the siege tanks. They're extremely powerful for what they do. I mean, if he goes lots of turrets anti-air here, then he can actually deal a lot of damage, especially if I'm not paying attention to his turrets. Once I've sort of realized that he's doing that, I can, of course, instantly destroy all of his turrets. But, yeah, it's just a sort of a slowdown feature in the game that I think is sort of unnecessary. Lurkers, I think, are going to work the same sort of way. If somebody gets a little bit ahead, there's going to be this wall of lurkers that they're going to have to try and push through. If they've gone air, at the very least, that works. So there's that option. But if you've not gone air, then you're going to have to figure out where they are. Then you're going to have to fight through them, taking pretty bad losses in the process. So all of those sort of things make it so that the game gets delayed for a player who's behind. It's a comeback mechanic. I don't think that's a necessary one. They should have made it so that they could come back in a way that's not going to drag out a game and still lead to sort of the same result, in my opinion. I mean, this Terran player, he can slow down my attack by having these Widow Mines around here, and I'm just too lazy to build detection because I don't really need it, but it is slowing down the game by a considerable amount. It's making it very difficult for me to finish off my opponent here. It's making it very difficult for the game to get closed out. So one of the other things that I'm going to talk about is what I sort of hope for in this. I'm hoping that they don't use the sort of units that you're seeing them producing here, that are either too... Well, they've gone the right direction for some units. They haven't gone the right direction for all of them. I'm hoping that they keep units simple enough for players to use. Like, the Widow Mine is actually pretty simple to use. It's not that hard to use a Widow Mine. But it is hard to counter. So I hope that they ultimately have units that are both easy for a new player to deal with to some degree. It doesn't have to be like they don't have to have any skill, but they've made the skill ceiling even higher, and I just don't think that that was really the good idea in Heart of the Swarm. So that's my opinion on it. I really hope that they are going more in the direction of the Adept for the Protoss, more in the direction of the... I think it's called a Ravager for Zerg. I can't really remember. It's a very long-range artillery unit that requires a little bit of micro, but not too much. I think it still has a normal attack, so it's still effective even if you don't do that. But those are the kind of units that I'm hoping that they go towards for a little bit, at the very least. Just because players, I don't think, are really playing StarCraft as much as they used to anymore. And a big reason that I think that they're not is that it's simply a very difficult game to get into now. If you're not already at the top tier of it, so many little things like these Widow Mines become very difficult and frustrating to play against. And if you're getting frustrated playing against these Widow Mines, if you're getting frustrated playing against Lurkers, which was something that was a problematic unit in my opinion in the in Brood Wars, you're just probably not going to play the game. You're not going to learn it. I mean, you have to have the game simple enough at some level that a person who's just learning the game can learn it without getting too frustrated. And as it is, there are just too many units that are frustrating to either use effectively or to counter effectively. So anyway, this is my opinion of StarCraft right now, what I'm hoping to see from it. It's a game that I really enjoy, so we'll have to see how that goes. And as always, I hope to see you all next time.